Continuing our journey on The Rise the Limit, we open Chapter 22, The Beat Divides a House. After last chapter's retreat from Shibuya's modern chaos, the focus shifts to the city's historical fractures, beginning with the police force's origins in a civil war that pitted a commander against his former lord. This theme of divergence becomes personal as a family outing falls apart, culminating in the protagonist breaking away to eat dinner alone, turning a shared trip into a solitary one. The beat divides a house. Father turns on son. Ancient bonds break like spring ice. Stone holds water deep. Concrete citadel, a sanctum's secret service. Our final full day in Tokyo arrived, not with a gentle Japanese sunrise, but with a sweltering blanket of heat. After a week of disciplined fun that felt more like a logistical exercise than a vacation, the city seemed determined to boil us. One could argue that paying a fortune for a suite at the Ritz-Carlton should exempt you from weather, but apparently that's an add-on package. We fueled up at the breakfast buffet, an arena that combined ballroom elegance with the quiet desperation of a commodities exchange. The buffet itself was a masterclass in human nature. I watched a man in a blazer, who presumably could afford his own banana plantation, deftly palm a half-dozen of them into a designer backpack. We were paying $2,500 a night, and I assume he was not on a Groupon, yet he acted with the furtive urgency of a man liberating office supplies. The giant rooms upstairs were a fine compensation, but getting to the croissant station required the kind of aggressive maneuvering usually reserved for boarding the last helicopter out of Saigon. Fortified and carrying no contraband fruit ourselves, we stepped out into the humid blast of Minato Ward. The walk was an open-air museum of aggressive capitalism. We passed dealerships where Lamborghinis and Ferraris crouched like caged, paranoid lizards. We ambled by a cemetery that, given its location, was almost certainly the most valuable piece of non-operating real estate on the planet. I imagined the resident ghosts hovering above their plots, smugly discussing their posthumous Zillow estimates. Then we saw it, rising. From between two ordinary office buildings was a structure that looked like it was designed by a James Bond villain who had just fired his architect. Out of a volcano. It was a massive, sloping pyramid of black granite, appearing less like a house of worship and more like the global headquarters for Spectre. This, it turned out, was not the lair of a power-mad lunatic, but the Ryukai Shakaden Temple. It serves as the world center for a Buddhist movement founded in 1925, a do-it-yourself faith where the congregation runs the show. This branch of Nichiren Buddhism focuses on honoring your ancestors, which seems reasonable enough. Their main form of outreach is called Michibiki, or guidance, a term that sounds considerably more pleasant than the robocalls I get about my car's extended warranty. The building's profound oddness, however, was only getting started. It was completed in 1975 by the Takanaka Corporation, the same super general contractor that built Tokyo Tower and the Tokyo Dome. This explained the ambition, if not the aesthetic. Inside, the main hall seats 3,500 people and contains a pipe organ, because nothing says quiet Buddhist contemplation like a thunderous blast of Bach's toccata and fugue. But its most peculiar feature was completely hidden. Beneath this imposing monument to faith lies an emergency reservoir holding 1,500 tons of drinking water for the neighborhood. The Bond villain's lair had a secret, and the secret was civic responsibility. It's like discovering that the Spanish Inquisition's headquarters also housed a remarkably well-funded public library. A building for fanatics who were also radially good neighbors, a neighborhood of good radicals with a fanatical building. Satsuma's suppression, the founding fight of a force. Having paid our respects to what looked suspiciously like a Bond villain's headquarters, we left the giant pyramid-lair temple behind and walked back out into the Tokyo HEAT. Our final day was dwindling, and we were ticking off the last few items on our list. Next up was a destination you don't typically associate with the high-fashion district of Ginza, the Tokyo Police Museum. It's a free, multi-story building dedicated entirely to law and order, which feels like an ODD neighbor for boutiques selling $5,000 scarves. The first thing you learn is that the Tokyo Police have a mascot. This is not a joke. It's a cheerful, cartoonish figure, and it is everything. In the US, our law enforcement gets armored personnel carriers. In Japan, they get a cute, marketable character. I suspect this is a fundamentally more effective approach to community relations. Inside the museum, kids were crawling all over a retired police helicopter and trying on tiny uniforms, while we adults were left to ponder the exhibits, which we were strictly forbidden from photographing. It's a bold PR strategy to build a museum to show off your history and then tell people they can't take pictures of it. So how did Japan, a nation of legendary swordsmen and strict feudal codes, end up with a police force modeled on the French? They sent a guy. After the Meiji Restoration kicked the shoguns out and threw open the country's doors in the 19th century, a man named Kawaji Toshiyoshi was dispatched to Europe to shop for a policing system. He was apparently quite taken with what he saw in Paris and returned with a host of suggestions that became the bedrock of the modern force. His most brilliant and enduring import was the concept of the koban. These are the little police huts, like glass-walled sentry boxes you see on street corners all over Japan. They were designed to embed officers directly into the neighborhoods, making them a constant and approachable presence. Kawaji, the father of the Japanese police, basically invented the idea of the friendly neighborhood cop, just with more paperwork and less lethal martial arts. He gave them European-style uniforms, a strict command structure, and the institutional authority of a newly centralized government. His new system faced its ultimate test in 1877. A rebellion broke out in his home province of Satsuma, led by the samurai Saigo Takamori, who happened to be Kawaji's former lord. Kawaji, the man who had traded his swords for bureaucracy, was put in charge of the police forces sent to help crush the revolt. His new model police, representing Japan's future, helped defeat the very samurai traditions he came from, a victory that must have felt like strangling your own ghost. The Two Sons of Satsuma, a nation's hero and its policeman. In his book Inventing Japan, Ian Baruma writes, "The Meiji Restoration was less a restoration than a revolution." Fresh from the Tokyo Police Museum, where we'd learned how its founder helped dismantle the old samurai system, that observation felt particularly sharp. The man who built the modern police force, Kawaji Toshiyoshi, and the celebrated hero Saigo Takamori came from the same Satsuma clan. They were brothers in arms who fought together to topple the old government. A decade later, they were trying to kill each other in a civil war. It's the kind of tragic irony that history adores. Saigo, the last true samurai, saw an invasion of Korea as a fine way to give his unemployed brethren a noble new purpose. Kawaji, having just returned from a tour of Europe's police headquarters, countered that Japan should probably build itself up at home before starting fights with the neighbors. The modernizers carried the day, Saigo stormed off home, and a few years later he was leading a rebellion of disgruntled swordsmen. And the man tasked with helping to crush it? His old comrade Kawaji, now the nation's top cop. It was a brutal civic divorce, where one partner got the state and the other got a rebellion. This collision of past and future was on my mind as we walked through Ginza, a district that has clearly chosen a side, and it isn't the one with swords. Our destination was a building with a history as tangled as any family dispute. an art museum designed by the famous architect Le Corbusier. It holds the collection of Matsukata Kojiro, a shipping tycoon who dreamed of opening a sheer pleasure art museum. After World War II, the French government snagged the entire collection he had stashed in Paris, classifying it as enemy property. Following years of diplomatic haggling, France proposed a deal that sounded suspiciously like a hostage exchange. They would return some of the art, but only if Tokyo constructed a world-class museum to put it in, and, naturally, the museum had to be designed by a French architect. The result is the National Museum of Western Art, a permanent monument to a deal where the person who takes your property also gets to dictate the blueprints for the shed you must build to get your lawnmower back. Inside, it's packed with Monet, Renoir, Van Gogh, and a truly staggering number of Rodin's sculptures, because Matsukata and the sculptor were friends. We paced the cool, silent halls, looking at impressionist masterpieces. My son, having apparently met his lifetime quota for silent halls and masterpieces, clenched his fists and declared he was done with art forever. As a final twist, Matsukata's world-class collection of 8,000 ukiyo-e woodblock prints, sold off in the 1920s, was mostly bought by a single collector and now sits in the Tokyo National Museum, a short walk away. With the Sheer Pleasure Art Museum now filed under parental folly, we began a death march through the Tokyo heat in search of other items on my checklist. This included a paint company's headquarters that looked like it had been sneezed on by a rainbow and a mall undergoing a renovation so vast it felt like we were navigating the ruins of a lost city. The architectural maze finally ejected us, hungry and defeated, into the crossfire of a classic family standoff, the dinner debate. My wife and son were on a holy quest for conveyor belt sushi. They found a restaurant with a 40-minute wait, a delay they accepted with the quiet stoicism of pilgrims approaching a sacred relic. I, however, have a profound philosophical objection to waiting for food. "I'm out of here," I announced, abandoning their mission. Down the hall, a chicken katsu place with no line served me a fantastic meal. An hour after they had been seated, they were still at the sushi place, so I wandered the mall's brightly lit corridors. And there, in a small pet shop window, was the single-cut-est, floofiest Pomeranian on the planet. It was no bigger than a large hamster, a perfect, absurd little puffball of a dog, a world full of stolen art and samurai ghosts stared out at by a little puffball of a dog in a pet shop window. Beaming behemoth, blending bureaucracy and big screen battles. My family's brief self-imposed separation for dinner had run its course. Much like the two Satsuma samurai who picked opposing sides in a civil war, we had chosen different paths. Katsu for me, conveyor belt sushi for them, and now had to figure out how to be a single unit again. Our peace treaty was an evening trip to Shinjuku to see a light show. On the way, as if to remind me of the mundane world I was trying to escape, an airplane on final approach to Haneda drifted perfectly into frame, and I dutifully snapped its picture. We were there to see the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building, which, after dark, moonlights as the world's largest television. Billed as a record-breaking projection mapping display, the show's producers had made the only logical choice for their main feature, Godzilla. There, splashed across the 48-story facade where earnest public servants normally process building permits and manage water utilities, the great lizard himself was busy trying to demolish his old foe. Watching a giant monster attack the very symbol of civic order felt like the ultimate expression of public dissatisfaction. You can't just go around projecting enormous monsters onto any old skyscraper. This building has history. When it opened in 1991, this twin-towered behemoth, designed by the celebrated architect Kenzo Tang, was the tallest building in Tokyo. It was a proud statement of the city's power. This status immediately made it a target. In the grand tradition of the franchise, Godzilla showed up that same year in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah to try and knock it down, because smashing the newest, fanciest landmark is how he shows affection. The city, recognizing a good thing when they saw it, decided to lean in. They now blast the building with light nightly, a state-sanctioned reenactment of its own cinematic destruction. It's not every government that commemorates its own fictional demise with a Guinness World Record. The technology is really just a glorified slide projector, albeit one that requires a supercomputer and enough electricity to power a small town. They create a precise 3D model of the building and then use an army of projectors to splash animated content onto its face, smoothing over the seams so it looks like one single building-sized image. It's a bit like giving a mountain a temporary tattoo. This all fits neatly into Shinjuku's persona as a hub of chrome-plated modernity, a place that also features a giant Godzilla head peering over a hotel, because you can never have too much monster-based tourism. Back at our hotel, I decided to see what room service had to offer. The menu featured crab croissant waffles. They were not croissants that tasted like crab, nor were they waffles with a side of crab. They were a single, unified creation. They were a culinary marvel born of profound indecision. They were a cry for help from the kitchen. They were, in a word, interesting. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 22, The Beat Divides a House, where we saw how a foundational national conflict could be mirrored in the simple fracturing of a family's shared path. For our finale, the tour concludes inside an empty museum, a final architectural stop whose lack of a collection becomes its defining feature. Until then, thanks for listening to The Rise the Limit. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Shinkansen, and Sensibility. And if you want to come behind the scenes, get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Continuing our journey on The Rise the Limit, we begin Chapter 23, From Manga to Maga. After a solitary conclusion to the trip in Tokyo's eclectic art scene, the flight home presents an unexpected pivot from Japanese pop culture to international politics. A layover in Calgary becomes a front-row seat to a G7 summit, where the security demands of world leaders bring one traveler's plans to a complete halt. From manga to maga. Manga halls close doors, presidents delay humble flights, justice leaves AirPods. The museum, that's a magnificent empty stage. After the quiet temples of Kyoto, our last morning in Japan felt like the final scene of a movie, where the protagonist suddenly remembers one last crucial errand. We had a flight to catch, but first we had an appointment with some dreadfully dazzling design. Tokyo's Roppongi district is home to the National Art Center, a building that makes a compelling argument that architecture itself is the highest form of art. The place is a famous paradox. It's one of the nation's biggest museums, yet it has no permanent collection. This is not because of a capricious burglary or an extreme case of Marie Kondoing. It was designed this way. It is a spectacular, beautiful, and completely empty stage, a vessel built by the late architect, Kisho Kurokawa. His parting gift to the city was a massive, rolling wave of steel and glass that seems to be permanently cresting over the street. Inside, the light is everywhere. The main hall is a vast public space where two enormous concrete cones stand upside down, as if a pair of giants had carelessly left their funnels behind. These structures, which look like something from a more elegant version of Dune, house a cafe and a restaurant, making them the most stylish places on earth to overpay for a cup of coffee. The Germans call this kind of place a Kunsthalle, an art hall. It's a landlord for traveling shows, a high-culture event space that might host a blockbuster Monet exhibit one month. and a convention for avant-garde garden gnomes the next. What was on the bill for our final frantic visit? A showcase of modern manga, a study of 1960s architecture, an exhibition of designer chairs, and a hall of Japanese calligraphy. Did these shows have anything in common? Absolutely not. It felt like channel surfing through a nation's entire cultural output. We saw stark manga panels, then sterile architectural models, then chairs that looked profoundly uncomfortable. Finally, we faced the calligraphy, which I am told is a sublime art form. I believe it. But to my Western eyes, it's hard to shake the feeling that I'm admiring the universe's most elegantly written grocery list. Having mainlined a semester's worth of discordant art, our cultural duty was done. The clock was ticking. The transient exhibits in their temporary home felt right for the end of a trip. A collection of beautiful things you see for a moment, before they and you move on. The museum is a bit like the ship of Theseus, a landmark whose identity is constant, even as its contents are completely replaced. And now, we're packing up to go. The world's most exclusive and powerful steering committee. After a tour of Japan that had me contemplating everything from the structural integrity of ancient temples in Kyoto to the digestive system of the mantis shrimp, I assumed the final leg home would be a quiet, featureless glide into oblivion. Travel, I've found, is a pursuit where your most profound realizations often come not from a premeditated pilgrimage to a sacred site, but from being stuck somewhere you don't want to be. It turns out the universe had one last lesson for me, and it would be delivered not in a tranquil Zen garden, but on a slab of concrete at the Calgary airport. We boarded our 787 in Tokyo, an act of such swift and silent competence that it felt less like herding cats and more like being absorbed by a very polite organism. It stood in sharp contrast to our departure from North America, which had all the choreographed grace of a mattress falling down a flight of stairs. We were off on time, climbing smoothly into the sky, leaving one continent behind for another. It was upon landing that the trip's quiet conclusion went completely off the rails. Through the window, the airfield was a sea of flashing lights. A whole fleet of police cars and black SUVs blocked off roads, their strobing reds and blues painting the cabin in silent, urgent pulses. Wow, I thought, they must have finally caught someone trying to smuggle a suitcase full of undeclared maple syrup. The situation grew stranger as we taxied toward the gate. We passed a pair of Japanese government aircraft, one from Germany and another from Australia, all gleaming like exotic birds far from their native forests. I raised an eyebrow at my wife. This felt less like a homecoming and more like we'd accidentally landed in the middle of a Tom Clancy novel. A quick search on my phone provided the answer. We had, with impeccable timing, arrived at the precise location of a G7 conference. As our plane sat motionless on the tarmac, I had plenty of time for some light reading. The Group of Seven, I learned, is essentially the world's most powerful homeowners association, an informal club where leaders of 7 major economies get together to coordinate global policy. It has no headquarters and no treaty, which makes it sound suspiciously like a group chat that got out of hand. The members are the usual suspects: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK and the US, with the European Union attending as a non-voting member like a nephew at the grown-ups table. This whole arrangement started in the mid-1970s when finance ministers decided to meet and complain about the oil crisis. It evolved into a leaders' summit in 1975, and Canada joined a year later, presumably after promising to bring donuts. For a while they let Russia join, changing the name to the G8. This social experiment ended in 2014 when Russia was suspended for annexing Crimea. which is the geopolitical equivalent of being uninvited to Thanksgiving for stealing the host's silverware. Our pilot eventually announced we'd be held until the official motorcades cleared the area. The agenda for this particular summit, held down the road in Kananaskis, was dominated by war in the Middle East and Ukraine and ongoing trade disputes. The leaders inside were debating the course of global history. We on the plane were debating the odds of our checked bags making the same journey we did. They wrestled with the fate of economies, while I wrestled with a growing need to find a restroom that wasn't 10 feet from a co-pilot. The flying fortress that is the White House in the sky. My prediction that the final leg of our journey home would be uneventful was, it turns out, adorably naive. Having discovered we'd landed in the middle of a G7 summit, our 9-hour layover in Calgary had transformed from a simple stopover into a front-row seat for a geopolitical circus. From our airport hotel window, the tarmac looked less like a transportation hub and more like a parking lot for the global elite. It was from this vantage point that I spotted the unmistakable blue and white livery of a very specific Boeing 747. It seemed Air Force One had crashed our party. People think Air Force One is a plane. It isn't. It's a call sign, a magic word that tells air traffic controllers to treat whichever hunk of metal the president is on as the most important thing in the sky. The term was born in 1953 after a commercial flight and President Eisenhower's plane shared a flight number, leading to a moment of airborne confusion. This was apparently enough to justify a unique identifier, ensuring the president's plane would never again be mistaken for a United flight to Poughkeepsie. The planes most people associate with the name, the massive VC-25s, are essentially flying White Houses, complete with a presidential suite, a situation room, and an operating theater. They can be refueled in mid-air and are hardened to survive a nuclear blast, which seems like a feature you hope to never actually field test. Watching the Prime Minister of India land and get his official welcome, I felt like a kid with a powerful but deeply nerdy ant farm. Down in the lobby, the international flavor was even thicker. The place was teeming with an Italian delegation, including military guys in sharp uniforms who looked like they were mentally critiquing the hotel's defensible perimeters. The whole scene was a bizarre intermission. To escape the gravity of world affairs, we sought refuge in the most aggressively normal place we could think of: the airport Chili's. There we were met with a diplomatic incident of our own. The Canadian Chili's did not have baby back ribs. I ask you, what is the point of a Chili's, an institution built on the twin pillars of questionable decor and a jingle about ribs, if it forsakes its sacred duty? Are there no international standards? Our brief flirtation with global politics and sauceless barbecue ended as our departure time approached. We had hoped to see Air Force One depart, a spectacle of priority and power, but our own flight was calling. We trudged to the gate for our 0030 flight to Atlanta, only to find it delayed. The first excuse was a problem with the brakes. Then they swapped out our plane entirely for one that had apparently been built before the invention of the internet. Every single flight on the departures board was delayed, so the technical difficulties line felt a bit thin. Once we finally boarded, the captain came on the intercom and confirmed our suspicions with the weary honesty of a man fresh out of euphemisms. They would have had time for maintenance, he explained, but because President Trump was departing, the entire flight line had been frozen. They held a medevac helicopter for him. They held Marco Rubio on his smaller jet. After the Donald's plane and its entourage finally stumbled their way into the sky, Ukraine's President Zelensky landed. The world's most powerful man disrupted our flight, and as one president departed, another arrived, leaving us sitting on the tarmac, waiting. Row rage, retribution for a rushing rude. The world is a stage, but the play is badly cast. Oscar Wilde. Watching presidents and prime ministers bring an entire international airport to a screeching halt from our hotel window had been an education in choreographed power. I figured our flight home would be a quiet epilogue. After the pristine order of Tokyo, the G7 circus in Calgary had been a study in contrasts. This final leg, however, was a deep dive into the practical application of chaos theory. The lesson began with boarding. In Japan, we had filed onto a jumbo jet in 15 minutes flat. Here in Canada, it took 40 minutes to cram a fraction of the people onto a modest 737, a clear sign we were back in the part of the world that treats efficiency as a light suggestion, like flossing. My assigned seat came with an immediate border dispute. My neighbor, a man who saw personal space as a colonial frontier, launched a swift and total annexation of the shared armrest. It was a brazen land grab, an act of manifest destiny executed with a fleshy elbow. I briefly considered citing the Geneva Conventions, but settled on a passive-aggressive counter-offensive. I planted my flimsy glass cup of ginger ale on the contested territory. It stood there, a tiny, defiant consulate in the face of his imperial ambition. Wars, I reminded myself, have been fought over less. Just as I was drafting a strongly worded démarche in my head, a flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin drone. The crew needed a doctor. My wife, being one, raised her hand. An attendant waved her off. The passenger, she explained, had merely fainted. The real emergency, apparently, was that they needed someone who spoke Spanish. This implied a fascinating medical theory where consciousness is language-specific. My wife, a skilled physician suddenly rendered useless by a vocabulary gap, sat back down. The universe, it seems, has a very peculiar sense of humor. When we landed in Atlanta, a brief, shining moment of human decency flickered to life. As EMTs boarded to assist the fainter, the entire plane remained seated and quiet. People with tight connections held their ground. It was a portrait of collective patience, a fragile truce. Then one man, several rows back, stood up. The spell shattered. A silent universal accord rippled through the cabin. The social experiment was over. It was every man, woman, and child for themselves. The dam of civility burst, and leading the charge was my seatmate, the armrest emperor. He snatched his bag from the overhead and bolted. And that's when he left his AirPods. "Ha!" I announced to my wife, a little too loudly. "That guy was a jerk the whole time." A woman in the row behind us snickered. Then I saw them, gleaming bone white on the formerly disputed territory. His little electronic prizes, abandoned in the mad dash for freedom. I held them up like a captured battle standard. This is how you declare victory in a silent war, fought over a plastic divider. You hold up the spoils for all to see. It was a small, satisfying victory in a war nobody else knew was being fought. A fittingly petty end to a trip that consistently proved our meticulously planned itinerary was merely a set of polite suggestions the universe felt free to ignore. You might think the search for an authentic Japan is about finding some untouched ancient truth. It is not. It's about accepting that the real country lives in the collisions between the old and the new. It's a place where you can watch a 1,000-year-old fire ritual in a temple and then have your entire day derailed by a faulty transit card. It's where samurai history is memorialized on a ceiling above tourists sipping matcha lattes, and where the most iconic Okinawan dish is taco rice, a meal invented to feed hungry American GIs. My own exit was less triumphant. Finally given permission, being in seat 1A put me first in line to deplane, but our luggage was in an overhead bin a few rows back. This forced me to swim upstream against a tide of frantic travelers to retrieve it. Thanks to global entry and no checked bags, we sailed through customs and stumbled onto the curb into the cool Atlanta morning. Our ride was not there. The trip's most memorable moments were never on the ticket. They happened in the margins. A cancelled fishing trip that turned into a thrilling high-speed glider ride, the solemn history of a sinking airport, or the unexpected sight of a flying fox silhouetted against the twilight. We learned that true understanding comes not from grand vistas, but from appreciating the intricate history of a single corporation or the community effort that rebuilt Otage Nenbutsuji Temple one hand-carved statue at a time. The trip was an education in patience, forged in the fires of crowded bamboo groves and cancelled excursions. Retreating from the glorious sensory assault of Tokyo to a quiet hotel room wasn't defeat, it was a strategic surrender. As we waited, a Waymo driverless car cruised past, its sensors pulsing with a soft, eerie light. It moved with silent, unnerving precision. Messy humans fought for armrests and abandoned their property in a panicked rush. The serene machine simply stayed in its lane. The future was coming, and it had much better manners and fewer humans. Our journey concludes, shifting from the curated impermanence of a Tokyo art hall to the disruptive reality of world leaders and the petty justice of forgotten AirPods. It's an amusing lesson on how we navigate temporary collections, whether of manga or of men, all before the final curtain call on the entire trip. As we reach the end, what's the one impression that truly sticks after the bags are unpacked and the world stops intruding? If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Shinkansen and Sensibility. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon.